Thank you, RJ, and thank you to everybody for being back with us after lunch. So maybe some in this crowd, but my bet would be not a huge number of people. More than 10 years ago, probably spent much time thinking about minerals, critical minerals in particular. But this crowd has, in fact, spent time with that very much in front of mind. And this conversation today is meant to get into some of the difficulties, the challenges, and the opportunities that lie ahead in very dynamic times. I want to start, Jakob, if I might pick on you first, given the global scale of Rio Tinto and your operations, I would be interested just to have you help us to frame in an initial fashion, why are these issues important in an energy conversation? Why are they difficult?
Well, it depends on from what perspective you look at it. Do you look at it from a nation point of view? Do you look at it from an industry point of view? The point is, supply chain security can be solved, but it's not an area that has had a lot of focus in the Western world for a number of decades. We used to do that if you go back to the time between the First World War, the Second World War. But the market mechanism has kind of made it the free market, which kind of works until it didn't work. And we had a little test of that when we had COVID a few years ago, where we suddenly realized that supply chain security is critical, and suddenly you lack these things. And the problem with this, as I say, there are solutions to critical minerals, but it's not solutions tomorrow. It takes a while to solve those issues.
So it takes a while, and lots of capital at risk. Anna, I want to come to you just for a kind of a further beat on this topic. A lot of the dynamism, which is good news for the industry, translates, I would think, into a lot of challenge for understanding just how fast markets are growing, where to put capital at work. So could you talk, for example, in particular about lithium markets and how Sigma Lithium thinks about those challenges and opportunities in the context of what Jakob was just saying?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, lithium is just a microcosm of the battery materials in different ways. I think, to Jacob's point, there were two breaking points that the industry neglected to take into account in planning. They're key. The first thing is that the nature in critical minerals, battery materials, and this wide array of future-facing materials, essentially, your client is no longer the base industries. Your client's now a tech company, because the materials end user is a battery maker, which today, if not a tech, behemoth, it will die. In batteries, you have a lot of concentration. So the nature of the client changing means the pressure upstream increased to be better, lower cost, more efficient, and to be keen on the fact that if the prices run out, you get innovated out. So the client's nature has changed, and the speed the speed at which we're asked to respond has also changed together with the demands of that client. And that appended everything in mining. Because then a lot of the companies, they were not thinking that fast, that way, or that nimbly, or allocating capital in sort of manners not concomitant to speed, ended up hostages to a narrative of somewhere in the world, someone's going to pay an inefficiency premium. You won't. These materials are abundant. They're going to be low cost eventually. A lot of technology processing investments coming in other parts of the world, especially in Asia. So we are actually at a challenge to be more like tech companies. However, this being mining, how do we do that? Because we have natural cycles of development. They're, in a way, longer. Well, it's tech, focus, shortening those cycles, reacting. I think the reaction speed needs to change. We need to change as an industry.
So, and part of the reaction time, part of that challenge, I would think, goes to the expectation of very significant growth in demand for minerals all across the landscape, but uncertainties about the specific market conditions that will apply in a given moment. So, Dominic, from the perspective of Appian Capital, could you give us a bit of your thoughts about how to think about demand growth in the whole suite of critical minerals with which your company is active? And how do you figure out how to time your actions, your moves properly?
So look, it's a great question, and thanks for everyone organising this and the chance to appear on this panel. Look, in crude terms, McKinsey reckon we need something like $3 to $4 trillion extra investment in mining by 2030 for the EV batteries, for the mobile phones, through to the F-16 fighter planes. So both economically and national security, the demand is enormous. Just to put that in some kind of layperson's perspective, we're going to need to mine more in the next 30 years than we have in the last 70,000 years. And yet the sector is incredibly concentrated. I mean, you compare it with oil and gas, where there's something like several players on 15% of the market. China you're talking about concentration of 60% up to 95%, depending on the mineral. I think we invest in a graphite company in Brazil, it's 80% concentration. So long-term, massive demand, but we also know, with the command economy that China operates, that it's not just price volatility. There is clear price manipulation going on. You see that with nickel, you see it with one or two others. And therefore, there's a short, long-term challenge here. What are the ingredients? Look, for most mining companies, I mean, I think Rio would probably agree, CapEx and the challenge with competing with China on CapEx is massive. So how do we get the capital finance in? Secondly, long-term risk. And China has been doing this. You know, you look at, even outside of China, you look at DRC, something like 17 out of 19 of the mines there, think of cobalt and copper, are owned by China. So they've been doing this for 20 years. We're on catch-up, and we've got to try and make this a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. So capital is, I think, the biggest thing. Long-term risk, how do we manage that? How do we play to our strengths? How do we unlock that private sector investment? But so, for example, I look at the executive orders coming out of the new administration here. The stuff on permitting reform, really valuable. I think also some of the stuff about financing projects abroad. So Exim Bank, the Export Finance Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, investing abroad if you can get the offtake and the supply chains into the US. These are some of the things that I certainly Appian are watching very closely. I like Jacob, I don't have a counsel of despair here, but we're 20 years behind, and we need to think about how you build up those positive supply chains at a time of very fraught geopolitical fault lines and massive concentration in the sector.
Joe, I'd like to draw you in, if I might, at this point. We've just heard about some of the complexities, yet there are still new entrants that are seeking to play roles in the minerals extraction and refining spaces that they hadn't necessarily done in the past. And I know from your vantage point, living in Riyadh, you may have a sense of that. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the Gulf, and particularly in the Kingdom, in relation to minerals extraction and refining.
Well, that's right. As the other panelists know who are in the mining sector know, Saudi Arabia, the mining industry for Saudi Arabia is a new strategic sector. They last year, I think they increased the value of exploited potential minerals and rare earth minerals from like 1.5 trillion to $2.5 trillion worth. And they have a little bit of everything. And so it's become a very big strategic industry for them. They just announced a $100 billion new project venture that they're seeding with $20 billion to develop some of this domestic capability. They're starting new joint ventures, both with companies in Saudi Arabia and also international companies, again, with the eye to really develop potential supply chain in Saudi Arabia, but also to explore internationally. Aramco, I think, just joined with Ma'aden to start this international venture to look at other parts of the world. But also, even in Saudi Arabia itself, Aramco is looking at extracting lithium from brine in oil fields, and there's a target of 2027 to be producing lithium in the country. So there's a lot of, and this is mostly new, as everybody up here knows. And the difference is not only is it a new frontier, like places in Africa and Latin America, it's a place where there's financial capabilities and resources to partner. And so they would love for some of these companies to come to Saudi Arabia and others, some of these big players, to help them develop this sector. And they very much want to be a strong supporter and partner. But for them, it's they're doing a lot of things throughout their economy, looking at it very strategically. And the mining sector and critical minerals and the minerals needed for future industries is so important to them right now.
So, Jakob, can we anticipate some joint venturing in the kingdom from a Rio Tinto or peers at that scale of the global mining industry?
Look, when you talk mining and extraction, the first point we do is we go after the geology.
Right.
And then sometimes the geology leads us to a place where the country is highly unstable and is a bit difficult. But in general, our exploration teams, that's where it starts. The geologists find out. And it's very important for society at large. Take an example. Some places on Earth we find copper with 5% copper. But most places it's been extracted with 0.5% of copper. And it goes without saying, if you have 5% copper, then every time you extract a tons of copper, you've got 20 tons of waste. But with 0.5, you have 200 tons of waste. So the impact on nature is hugely important to look at as well. Right now, Saudi Arabia is in the exploration stage. We haven't really found a lot yet in Saudi Arabia. But the Middle East in general is an area that has access to a lot of energy and also increasingly renewable energy. And that means that processing is an opportunity there. And I think it's important, if you want to talk about materials, you have to think about the extraction part and the processing part. Right. And it's two completely different dynamics that plays out. On the extraction part, it's very much about getting access. We, for example, would love to do more here in the US, but the US is one of the slowest nation of permitting a mine. In fact, the US has not permitted a hard rock mine since 2008. It was a copper mine to us. And we right now have a copper mine that we have worked on for 15 years and still haven't got permit on this. So that model really doesn't work. But that's the extraction part. The processing part is completely different. It's about access to cheap energy. It's about being able to compete. And the Chinese are massively effective. I mean, they're just very, very efficient. And we need to learn to build things faster and cheaper in order to compete.
So, but I want to pick up on the turn of phrase that Dominic had about race to the top or race to the bottom, right? That environmental impact that you very rightly highlighted, Jakob, is I think a part of why in many OECD countries it has been very difficult to do mining or reprocessing. Now, there are also cases of very high standard, good performance. So I would be interested in the thoughts of any of you on what are the key both policy structures and also codes of conduct from industry, et cetera, that can take one to the race to the top rather than the bottom.
But if I may just start off, because I just want to say a longer permitting process does not mean that you get better environment. I mean, we set absolutely the highest ESG standards. We have to have that, and we would never shortcut anything with local communities. But there's a lot of red tape going on in most countries, and you could do things much faster. And the reality is, ever since the Second World War until today, it just goes slower and slower to progress these things.
Right. But I would similarly think that for a serious company that is attending to, as we say in the States, it's minding its P's and Q's, being careful about impacts and interactions with local communities, et cetera, you, I think, naturally wouldn't have an interest to see other competitors performing in less careful ways because they're frankly, they're cutting corners on you. So what are the ingredients that help to create that race to the top? Any thoughts on this?
Well, look, since I posed the question, let me have a go at the answer. Look, I actually think that the objective reality of the best practice is pretty good, but perception lags reality. We invest in a graphite plant in Bahia. We've, last August, started to create what's called a tree curtain of native species to deal with air, noise, and other aspects. I think our lessons from Brazil, and I'd be interested in Anna's views, get in there early and try and roll the pitch, as we would say in the UK, with the enlightened self-interest of a really positive ESG strategy. The second element...
Sorry, roll the pitch in this case, meaning kind of engage with the community?
Engage with the stakeholders. The more sensitive the stakeholders, the earlier you should get in there.
Right.
The second aspect is, there's a really interesting piece. We invest in a US Strategic Metals in Missouri, a really interesting piece around recycling. So it's lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, but we also recycle the lithium-ion batteries which create black mass feedstock. That area is really interesting, both because recycling is a good thing to do in itself, but also that's something, if you're trying to bridge supply and demand, it's a smart thing to do. I think a very strong area of growth, and for the US, which wants to be high innovation, we talk about high standards, is very strong. The elephant in the room is where the manufacturers, the EOMs in all of this. And McKinsey did a survey recently and asked business leaders at the OEMs how much they would pay for ESG premium minerals. And fewer than 15% would pay 10% more for ESG grade minerals. And yet you think about what's happening to price, nickel and elsewhere, and the cratering of the market, and you think about the long-term interest of high quality, reasonably priced minerals, that's crazy. By the way, when I last at a summit made this comment, a hand went up and someone said, I think the 15% are lying about this. But that shows you the problem. The OEMs are not bought into this. How do you do that? I'm not sure you're going to mandate OEMs to do this, but somehow we need to find a way to lock them in to the long-term interest that they've got in securing their supply chains, as well as the short-term shareholder value.
Please.
But that goes back, I completely concur with you. I think when you think about traceability, you have to revive things this country has done with the blood materials, with the tantalum in 2015. That's basic, costs nothing to the taxpayer, very palatable. That kind of sets the floor. But that floor is still a low-cost floor. You need to deliver scale at low cost, and you have to be traceable, not because there's a premium, just because otherwise you don't get into certain supply chains if there's a government mandate on end user, because if there isn't, it's a free-for-all. So ultimately, we're saying this because we all deal with it. We deliver the very best material with $0 of premium, and we have to live with it. That's life. Now, what is our challenge then? It goes back to the beginning. We have to be more like tech companies. How to deliver these materials in large scale, at low cost, because it's a volume business. I mean, you want a lot of cars on the road. You want cheap EVs, yes, because that's how you get adoption. And then maintain traceability and stay low cost. So low cost, traceable, hard to scale. You need to scale. Scale, low cost. You have a lot of countries that have been doing that. Sometimes traceable, sometimes not. The holy trinity of it is really hard. And you solve it with, behaving more like a tech company, like failure is not an option. I think that's part of what we are challenged to do in the next decade if we want to remain competitive in this industry. And to Jacob's point, you got mining and processing. Processing is many boxes. So you want to capture some of those industrial boxes, put technology in there so that you get more margins. And that way you escape the traps of delivering the Holy Trinity, because you're taking some industrial margins, reaping the benefits of the business model integration, putting it back into your mind to basically deliver traceable, staying low cost, and doing it at scale. So it's essentially trying to capture boxes of industrialization or processing remaining competitive, because you got a formidable competitor out there, which is pretty much anyone who's done that for a decade in China. You need to beat them on costs. And that's the usual game. I mean, you're out there in a global market, unprotected, and you need to beat the most formidable competitor. I mean, the US and the West has done this before. It's technology, it's brain power. It's something that has to be thought through differently. I think that would be what I would leave of it.
So I want to zero in on the topic of the kind of the market challenges, managing turbulence and managing the particular competitive dynamic that comes from China's dominance, particularly in the processing area. First of all, given the wild swings that you see in some of the prices for some of the ores and metals over the last couple of years, how do your companies think about growth and right-sizing in this really challenged market? Jakob, do you want to join in?
Yeah, no, thank you. First of all, I tend to always say we are a long-term company. And it's actually easier to predict the world 10 years out than next month. Because where is prices going? I don't know. What is going to happen? What will I read in the newspapers tomorrow? But now we are both in the lithium business. We all know that the energy transition is happening. We all know that the electrification society is happening. We all know that there's been sold more and more EVs. It's a given that there will be more demand for lithium 10 years from now. But I don't know. Some years it's very fashionable to have an EV car. Some years it's less fashionable. So it will go up and down. So we try to focus on what do we see 10, 15 years out. And the good news then is we are a diversified miner and we have a strong balance sheet. And that means that when you have choppy waters, like right now, you look at the stock indexes, etc., we try to not focus on that, but still keeping further out. And we can do that because we have a strong balance sheet.
I'm guessing, Joe, that in the case of the Saudis, that may be also kind of the supreme long-term play.
Well,
how do you assess
they're
things?
They're a big strategic investor in Lucid,
Yeah.
so they're in the EV business. But just to comment on some of the other observations that the panelists and most recently what you just said about EVs. I just ended at the end of last year my term as Secretary General of the IEF, and one of the big reports we did was on copper and EVs and electrification. And I think this is pretty central to your question of race to the top or bottom and what Dominic said about potential growth. And your average EV has about 60 kilograms of copper, whereas your average ICE engine is about 25 kilograms. It's a huge difference. The business as usual case for just keeping the economy going, forget about all the transition policies that would require a lot more copper, just to do basic, singles and doubles, if I can use an American baseball term. You're talking about needing 115% more copper in the world over the next 10 years. That's more copper that's ever been mined in human history. Okay, now you add in transition policies like 100% EVs by 2035. Now we need 55% more copper mines that exist today. And as everyone here, except for me, knows very personally, it takes, 23, 25 years to build a new copper mine, to get it permitted and all of this other stuff. So if governments, so I would say under basic policy scenarios today, we can't achieve any of these transition goals without a lot more copper mining and a lot more copper supply. And that's that's the most critical mineral of all, in my view, because it's needed for the general economy. It's needed to do so many of these other things that we want to do in terms of electrification. And of course, as a lot of people in this room know who follow energy closely, a lot of the peak oil scenarios, peak demand scenarios, are based on explosive growth of EVs. But if we can't do this new copper mining, maybe we should be talking about peak EVs, not peak oil supply, because none of these goals are achievable unless we do more mining of copper and other critical minerals that these folks are involved in here. And so I think this is, it's a little bit of a dilemma. In order to save the planet, we need to do more mining here, and it's an important discussion that needs to be had.
So, very timely question among the series of questions from the audience. Caitlin Hamilton asks about the significance of recycling as part of the total mix. I'd be interested in the views of any of you. Jakob, please.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and it's one of my most important taglines, because we're all responsible as consumers. So the question is, how well are we doing on recycling? Steel, copper, aluminium, 2024 compared to 2012. Are we recycling much more, about the same? Have you got any idea? I tell you what, we are recycling much less than we did in 2012.
Wow.
Very few are aware of that, and it's one of those kind of inconvenient truths.
What's the reason
And
for that?
I digged a little bit into the reasons behind it, and it's economics. It doesn't make sense. I mean, by the way, most scrap here in the US is being exported to China. So the bottom line is, it's a great question, thank you, and I think we can do much more. And I think we're all responsible for that.
Sort of tagging on that, one thing, again, that's typically overlooked is processing technology. And when you look at what goes on in Asia, there's an enormous amount of focus in processing technology. So one of our examples has been invest in it. So last quarter, and I hate the word quarter because our industry is built in many, many quarters, but it was the culmination of work where we managed to increase throughput in 30%. It's not recycling, but it's reprocessing something that we actually invested technology in doing, which were the dry stacked tailings piles. So we invested money into dry stacking tailing dams, and originally because of our social license, it got like no monetary bang. When the pendulum swung, we started to be criticized as per why build another facility with that technology, given that, quote, nobody cared. And we're like, well, we'll show you the economic case for it. So we started this project to basically go back to those tailings and actually mine it for residual lithium. And that increased production in 30%. So it's just a numerical illustration of my point of the tech mindset. How do we do more with less, right? And in our industry, we've been too slow to kind of adopt it without taking technology risks. These are like old, old methods of processing and separating. It's just looking at it with a new lens. Something that was used to process, separate diamonds now could be better. Maybe it could be suiting lithium. And that sort of mindset, I think, is kind of the way our companies, for example, the smaller mid companies like us, belong in the ecosystem to kind of create that agility. Because when you look at Asia, this is what this is. Upstream, you have a bunch of sigmas. This, Hungary, this sort of focus to actually try to lower the costs overall, to disrupt the way things are mined, to be able to have as much copper as you would need for as low as possible price, as soon as possible, right? That's the goal for some of these guys.
So I take the point that several of you have emphasized, and I think it is important always to keep in mind that one side of the conversation is extraction and the other is refining, and not identical sets of challenges. But now I want to ask you a really simple and straightforward question about the extraction side of things. And this is thanks to Noel Marder, who is a Columbia student in the Sustainability Management Program. What are your thoughts on deep sea mining? Not timely, too much risk, too much controversy, green light, go ahead. Any thoughts?
I think it's absurd. I think there's enough of what we need on the crust of Earth before it's disrupting that ecosystem. Category. I think it's absurd.
You were a little unclear on that.
No, I think it's absurd.
Thank you.
There's enough of everything here on surface.
Anybody else care to weigh in on this one?
I used to be a Foreign Office lawyer in the UK, and one of the first jobs they give a new Foreign Office lawyer is to go and work in the International Seabed Authority, Deep Seabed Authority in Kingston, which was this sort of international UN body, but was arguing about all of these issues, about how you would do it.
Is that because they liked you or they didn't like you?
I'll come on to that. I'm not sure. I still haven't worked that out. But the reality was no one thought this would ever happen. So they're making rules into relation to something where the innovation would change beyond anything we could imagine in the early 2000s. So now it's starting to happen and people are talking about it. I think there's definitely the resource there. Again, as Jakob said, the question always comes down to the technical aspects of how you get it out of the ground. And I don't think I have a clear enough lens on the risk reward to say that's something we're going to be investing huge amounts in the future. But the geopolitics of that, in the same way as Antarctica and outer space, are even more fraught than traditional mining. That's all I'd say.
Got it. Okay. So in a moment, I'm going to invite, but not require, that each of you, if you wish to, offer in a kind of lightning round fashion your thoughts on government or number of governments and a step that they might take that would help the rational and sustainable and long-term development of the minerals industry. But let me ask one other question from the audience first. This is from Vanessa Brieva, I'm probably butchering her name, a student who asks, are AI-driven tech solutions positioned to make a serious contribution to the mining and to the minerals industry, let me put it that way? Can AI help? Lots, little, too early?
Yeah, we've seen examples. Processing, again, you've seen, processing is essentially mineralogy. So you change the mineralogy, you need to think about ways of separating, purifying, concentrating, and later refining. AI learns from the mineralogy, becomes better and better and better. And that's not that sophisticated. You just throw a bot so that you actually learn with your own experience of processing. We've done that. It's not expensive, and it increases recovery yields. So there are a number of ways where you can actually learn from your data set by having a bot that reads it and reapplies it,
and
essentially.
in the upstream segment, opportunities? I mean, I've read some about some companies that are in this space.
Absolutely. I mean, we use it in underground mines, block caves, where you have to have a lot of sensors and knowing all the seismics in the rocks, and that's just basically an overflow of data that is beyond the human brain. And if you can organize that and use that in tech solutions and add AI to it, you simply can extract more efficient.
Right.
So there is a lot of value, and we are just at the foothill of the mountain to understand what the impact is.
Got it.
And this is exactly what should be happening. The question from the student was phenomenal. That's the zeitgeist. Upstream, midstream, like unsexy, boring industries need to become more in tune with, technology, the times, attract that kind of, talent, because that's what the industry needs to compete on that challenge. It has to be low cost, traceable, at scale, right?
Excellent. Okay. So now, again, I invite, but I do not insist, that if you had any thoughts in very quick fashion that you wished to highlight, a government or a couple of governments, and what you would wish that they would do more or differently, or et cetera. Again, on invitation-only basis.
Well, I would just go back to my point on copper mining as an example. I mean, if you're a country that has a 2035, 100% EV mandate, even though those years are slipping or adding on, you need to be open to copper mining. You can't have bans on mining in your country, or bans on financing of mining projects, or bans by multilateral institutions on mining projects. If you care about the transition and meeting these targets, you have to be also for mining. Right. And also I would again urge this window that it takes from inception to actually mining, 23 years, that has to be greatly reduced in any kind of scenario in order to meet our goals. I mean, in Germany, look at what they did with the LNG regasification terminals. The regulatory time on that was dramatically cut in more than half. I think it was cut, by almost 2/3.
Got it.
So we know we can do it if there's a commitment to do it and a commitment to these issues.
All right. Dominic?
Two things: better public-private partnerships, because governments are lousy at picking winners, certainly over the kind of time frame we're talking, and more friend-shoring, because none of us, given the concentration in the market, can do it on our own.
Got it. Jakob, Anna, anything?
I just wanted to
Yeah.
build on this because it's entirely doable. It is just a matter of from saying we want supply chain security to develop a long-term plan and have a little bit of patience, because, as you said, the time it takes to develop a copper mine, etc. It's quite easy to do predictions. I mean, in the U.S., there's been produced around 1 million tons of copper, but the U.S. consumes 2 million tons of copper. But the problem is, of course, with electrifications and EV, those 2 million tons might become 3 or 4 pretty soon. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you're seriously short in copper, despite the fact that you got amazing geology for copper mines. And we would certainly love to develop more in this country.
Great. You have the opportunity, but
yeah,
you're not.
no, it's sort of the same. I mean,
Okay.
it goes back to, you got to go where the resources are, is what Jakob was saying about geology. And it goes back to what business, well, it's clear that, the West is behind, right? So how do you catch up? Well, copy what works. And when you look at the original sourcing strategies of, we call integrating the business models that took place in China, for instance, by integrating upstream, that was copied from the Keiretsu model from Japan. The large trading companies in Japan had stakes and offtakes throughout the metals world, on and around the energy transition. China took it to a whole new level. That's the simple model, right? You don't have all the resources in one place. You want resilient. Geology matters, So you basically reinvent the wheel. You basically go back to the Keiretsu world, offtake for little stake, friend-shoring, a different version of friend-shoring with that kind of dual investment. And copy what works, right? Yes.
All right. Well, you've heard it here. Lots of opportunity to make the everyday and the geological look sexy. These markets, I should say, undoubtedly will not be boring for anyone that's paying attention to them going forward. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.